Hey everyone, how are you? Happy Friday! Happy Freaky Friday! Happy Paranormal Friday! Happy Friday! Happy freaking Friday! Are you excited it's the weekend? I'm jazzed it's the weekend, and I'm so excited to be here with you. So today, we're talking paranormal, we're talking witchy, and we're talking paranormal. So this week, I have been talking all about the witchy stuff. We're doing the witching hour this week. This is day 5 of the witching hour. And I saved your questions because this has been based on the questions that you asked. I saved all of your questions about the ghosts, the Ouija boards, the paranormal stuff, channeling, clairsenses, all of that stuff. I saved it all for Friday for today. That's what we're talking about. So, are you excited? I am excited. I'm excited to share this with all of you, my friends. So, I'm going to be sharing a lot of personal information tonight. I'm going to be sharing a lot of tips tonight. I'm going to be lifting the veil, quite literally in some cases, on a lot of things tonight. So let's dive into this. Hey everyone, I'm Angela. I'm a coach here in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm also a witch. I like going live, talking about creativity and imagination and energy, ways to live a green, imaginative, creative life where you're living in alignment with your values, because it feels good to live in alignment. So good to live in alignment with your values. Really good. So if you're joining me live, say hello to me in those comments down below like Shannon did. Hey Shannon, how are you this evening? And if you are catching me the second time around on that recycled video, drop a little recycled symbol in those comments down below so I know that you are there, so that I can still come back and say hello to you, so that we can have a little conversation in the comments, right? I'm gonna try to get that to focus because I'm a little blurry. Whoa, that is better. Hey everyone, how are you? Now I can see you too. All right, so like I said, this week we've been doing the witchy hour, right? The witching hour. And I've been talking about witches. And if you're just, hey Debbie, how are you? If you're just jumping on, say hello. Let me know you're here. And by the way, where are you from? Let me know where you're joining me from. I, again, am from Cleveland, Ohio. So we've been talking about what witches are, who witches are, what witches aren't, right? We separated some of that out in the beginning of the week. We've been talking about what witches believe in, what witches don't believe in, right? A little bit about what witches practice, a little bit about the different kinds of witches that we have. We have dove into what witches use to practice their craft, right? Hey T, how are you? We have dove into crystals. Last night we had Karina on from Incantations, and we dove all into crystals. And tonight we're talking paranormal. We're talking all about like the Freaky Friday stuff, Ouija boards, ghost channeling, and I'm going to talk about some stuff that I've never talked about publicly on my profile before. So grab yourself a drink, put on your big girl or big boy panties, because it's going to get real tonight. It's going to get fun tonight, and you just might learn a couple things. So are you ready? I'm ready. So the first thing that I want to say is that Ouija boards don't have to be scary. Ghosts don't have to be scary, right? Ouija boards are just a tool. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, right? It's a tool, just like other things, right? So if we think about cooking, how many of you have ever cooked? Let me know in the comments down below, right? No, I don't cook with my Ouija board, to be clear, but I'm going to tell you how this is related. If you cook, you use a knife to cut up your vegetables, and sometimes maybe you nick yourself, right? But just because your friend nicks themselves with a knife doesn't mean that we say all knives are bad and no one can ever use a knife again and knives are dangerous. Knives are a tool, and instead we teach knife safety. We learn how to use knives the right way. Ouija boards are a tool. By the way, they're also called spirit boards, right? Ouija board was branded. It was some amazing marketing at one point, right? There are spirit boards. Those existed a long time ago. They're the same thing. It's just that they don't say Ouija at the top, right? But so spirit boards or Ouija boards, they're just a tool, right? There's a way to use them that maybe is more effective and that probably is more beneficial, and where maybe it will calm, right, some of the apprehensions or anxieties that some of you had in your questions. So that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. But first, I want to talk to you about spirits in general, because the reason people use Ouija boards is to communicate with spirits. So first we need to talk about spirits. We need to talk about if we can communicate with spirits. Is that even real? Because if it's not, why the heck would we have a Ouija board? Why would we have a spirit board? Because there's nothing to communicate with if they're not real, right? So let's talk about that. So when we talk about communicating with something other than each other, like you and me right now, right? When we talk about communicating with our ancestors or spirits or spirit guides, etc., right? Anybody can do that. Anybody can communicate. So there are people who are gifted in this, right? And we're going to talk about some of those gifts tonight too. We're going to talk about some clairsenses. We're going to talk about mediumship. We're going to talk about being a sensitive, right? Sorry, I've got something in my eye. All right, it's a cat hair. It's not something, it's a cat hair. I know exactly what it is. All right, so we're going to talk about this. We're going to dig through this. So that's where I want to start with you right now. Hey, Julie, how are you? So let's talk about this, right? What does being a medium mean? How many of you have ever heard the term medium before? How many of you have heard the term psychic before? If you've heard these terms, drop them in that conversation box down below for me. How many of you have heard the term channeling? Someone channels, right? Maybe you've heard it on shows like Charmed. Maybe you've heard it on shows like Medium, right? Like maybe you've seen it on a TV show before, but let me know if like this is brand new to you, right? Maybe you do some of these things. Feel free to let me know that too if you want to. You do not have to let yourself totally out of the broom closet if you don't want to do that either, right? That's like a little witchy phrase you might have heard me say this week, by the way, right? Like a lot of witches are in the broom closet, like people don't know they're witches, and then like maybe 1 foot's out of the broom closet, right? That's like they're kind of out, but like not everyone knows. And like, hey everyone, like Angela's a witch and she came way out of the broom closet this week, right? Like she's kind of been out, but like there's no hiding it anymore, right? So like, yep, totally out of my broom closet. My brooms are all over, like made a mess this week. Lovely mess, but a mess. All right, so mediumship means meditating or getting yourself centered and then communicating, opening yourself up to communicate with someone in another realm, spirits, ancestors. Usually you're focused on who you want to communicate with, right? Maybe you're opening yourself up to communicate with anyone. Not usually. You're usually focused on another person, or you're calling for someone specific to communicate, or maybe it's because you're someone who's a highly sensitive person and you kind of just have this feeling, right, that something might be around, or maybe things have been moving around you. That happens, right? And so you realize that there may be a spirit around and you want to communicate. You want to ask if there's something they need, or you just want to open up the communication channels. So a medium may be working in that way, right? A psychic does not always communicate, right? There's a difference here. A psychic does not always communicate with spirits, right? A psychic sometimes can communicate with spirits, but a psychic is sort of this big umbrella term that we use to talk about clairsenses. How many of you have heard of the term clairsenses before? So we all have senses, right? We all are familiar with the 5, sometimes 6 senses, right? Like sight, smell, feeling, sight, smell, hearing, touch, right? And then we also have intuition as that 6th sense. But did you know that there's actually 8 other clairsenses? It's a psychic senses. 8 other ways that some people, a lot of people, can get information. I want to be clear that this is also something you do not have to be afraid of. This doesn't mean people are walking around like digging in your brain or anything else or any of those other funny things that we've been taught, right? But it means that people sometimes just pick up information, right? It means that sometimes people are gifted. It means that sometimes it's an annoyance, to be honest, right? Like sometimes you're like, oh, like I'm smelling something that I don't want to smell and I don't know where it's coming from and it's not in this realm and like, ugh, right? Like sometimes people pick up smells from like other realms. Sometimes people smell that there's a spirit, right? Like maybe the spirit used to smoke cigars and they smell a cigar despite the fact that no one is smoking, right? So there are lots of different clairsenses. you might have heard of clairvoyance, right? We in our society tend to talk a lot about clairvoyance, right? And we tend to talk about clairvoyance like it covers all of the territory, right? Like everyone who has a clairsense is clairvoyant, but that's simply not true, right? It's only one of 8, right? And clairvoyance actually the definition of it is seeing. It's the psychic sense, right? Or the gift of sight in your third eye. So like having visions or getting information through dreams or through visions, sometimes even while you're awake. So that's only one, right? There's also knowledge, there's smell, there's clairaudience where you're hearing, there's all of these different clairsenses, and I'm not going to go through them all tonight because there's other questions that you all had, but we need to talk about this kind of stuff in order to be able to talk about the ghosts, in order to be able to talk about the Ouija boards, in order to be able to talk about how we use these things and why we use them and why some people use them, and in order for you to be able to understand that not all witches do these things, but that some witches do them, and not everyone who does these things are witches, right? But that it does blend together. All right, so senses, gifts. They're gifts. And all of you have gifts. We all, as human beings, have gifts, right? Some of us, our gifts are just a little different sometimes. And some of us are gifted and highly sensitive. Some of us are gifted and super empathic. Some of us are gifted and empathic and can pick up the things that people feel, right, when they're living, right? The people who are around us. Some of us can do that and can sense when there are spirits around us who are no longer living in this realm, right? So I have trouble saying that they're not living. I'm someone who can and has for a long time been able to sense people who have transitioned, right? But I have a hard time saying they're not living because they're not living in our physical reality, but their spirit and their soul is still very much alive somewhere else, right? And so tonight I'm going to share with you some stories. I'm going to share with you how I first started realizing that I could literally see ghosts. I'm going to share with you how I spent a lot of my life begging not to be able to ever see them again, even though I could sense them. I'm going to share with you some tips and tools for using Ouija boards. I'm going to share with you some tips and tools for what to do if you think that there's a spirit, how you can draw boundaries, how you are allowed to draw boundaries, how you don't have to have ever done it before and you still get to draw boundaries. That is probably the most beneficial tip that I can give to anyone who ever watches this live, right? It is a super important tool, right? So let's start. So the first thing that you need to know is that in addition to being a witch, I have multiple clairsenses, right? I kind of feel like I'm on the X-Files right now and I'm like waiting for or not the X-Files, the X-Men, and I'm waiting for like, I don't know, an SUV to come pick me up because I'm about to come out with all my powers. All right, that's like sort of sarcasm, but also like a little element of fear, which is real because witches have an element of fear when they're about to come out of the closet, like even further. Okay, we're doing this anyways. Okay, so I have multiple clairsenses. And when I was 5 is the first time that I saw a spirit, right? I was in my grandma's bedroom, which happens to be the house that I grew up in, right? Like my entire childhood. Like my mom ended up buying the house. But I was in my grandma's bedroom and I saw a spirit. Now, here's the thing. We as parents have a tendency, not all of us, but some of us, that when our kids say they saw a ghost, we want to comfort them. And so we tend to do things like say, no, you didn't, right? Because we don't want them to be afraid. But there's a chance that your child also has gifts. And so you might be better off to teach your child about the gifts, or if you don't know about them, to try to learn about them, because your child might be like me and grow up knowing that they can see spirits, know that they sense all the things in the house that they grew up in, right? But because when I was 5, no one wanted to explain to a 5-year-old that she was seeing ghosts or try to figure out how to do that. I simply was told that I didn't see a ghost, but I knew that I saw a ghost. And like, I mean, it's still ingrained in my head. Like, I know what I saw, right? And I've continued to have lots of experiences since then, right? But so the first time that I saw a ghost was when I was 5 years old. But it was scary to me because no one had explained to me what was happening. No one could explain to me that it didn't have to be scary. No one could explain to me that it could be normal. No one could explain to me that it was a gift. And so I spent the majority of my life up till now, until a few years ago, begging the universe, never, 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 please, never, 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 never let me see one again. Never, please, right? I don't know what I thought was going to happen. I thought maybe I'd combust. I thought maybe I would literally lose my mind if I saw one again. I don't know what I thought was going to happen. And I knew I could sense them. I communicated with them. I just didn't want to see one. I was so afraid. Hey, Leah, how are you? Right? But so here's what I want to talk to you about, because the further I learned to embrace my gifts and lean into my gifts, and the more that I learned to learn about gifts, and the more I learned to learn about clairsenses, and the more I learned to learn about working with these tools, the more I learned I didn't have to be afraid. And the more I learned that it was going to be okay. And the more that my gifts grew and the stronger they got, like a muscle, and the more that I learned that I could see them and I wasn't going to combust and I wasn't going to lose my mind. And it was actually a pretty cool tool. So the first thing, and I'm going to share a couple more stories with you, but first I want to share a tip here. The first thing I want to teach you is that if you're like me, then, where you're scared, right? You think that you feel something, or you know that you feel something, or you know that there's a spirit, right? That happens in lots of different ways. When I was in college, right, I lived in an apartment where I very much was living with spirits, and they were not shy, and things moved. And it was an uncomfortable situation at first, right? If you are in a situation where it's uncomfortable, and I want to be clear that it's not always uncomfortable, right? I live very happily with spirits right now, and it's a very peaceful and even comforting situation. But if it's uncomfortable, you get to draw boundaries. You can do a couple of different things, and I made a list so I don't forget my list, right? So the first thing that you can do is that you can ask it to leave. You get to ask it to leave, and it has to listen. Okay, so you literally out loud can say, I don't want you here anymore. You need to leave. Okay, you get to ask, you get to set boundaries. You get to, it is a form of energy, and you get to set energetic boundaries. Okay, now something to keep in mind as I'm going through this list is that, hey Kathy, how are you? The majority of spirits fall into different categories, but maybe they're confused, right? Maybe they're stuck here, maybe they haven't transitioned, and maybe they're just confused. Maybe they've recently passed and they're kind of in a limbo, or maybe they've just crossed over and they're trying to understand what's happening. So they may not be doing what they're doing on purpose. Some spirits think they're funny, right? But they also don't mean you any harm, right? They're just funny. Kind of think of like your uncle or your grandpa who likes to play pranks, right? So they don't mean to be scaring you, right? But so most spirits like aren't trying to cause you harm, right? It's just that like you can't literally physically see a person, and think of like your brother when he comes up behind you, or your sister, right? And they like poke you and you don't know you're there, like it startles you. So of course it feels scary. But so think of that also when you're engaging with this, right? Like you're engaging with an energy or almost like a person, right? So you get to set boundaries. You can also set boundaries to a specific room. If you don't want to tell it that it can't be in your entire house or your entire apartment or your entire workplace, you can say like, you can't, like, I don't want you in my bedroom, right? Like, I understand you're here. Like, I respect the fact that you're here. I understand that there's a reason you're here. Like, I'm willing to to work through that, but I don't want you in my bedroom. Like, you're allowed to set energetic boundaries and say like, you know what, like this, like ask yourself, like, what is it that I need, right? Like, is it my bathroom, right? Like, there's been a time when like I was like, I can do this, but like I cannot be in the shower and feel like there's something right outside the shower, right? Like that wasn't okay for me. And I think that that's a reasonable boundary to draw. And so that's what I drew, right? Again, you just voice it out loud, right? You can also banish them. When I say banish, you can tell them to leave. You can smudge your house. You can use crystals, right? There's lots of different ways that you can set boundaries and you can make them go away. Okay? It is, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it is such a incredibly small amount of entities or energy where you have to like put more effort than that into getting rid of them. The vast majority of anything that anyone deals with, that's all you have to do, and you set your boundaries and it's a done deal. It's that simple, right? But you can also live peacefully. You can communicate with them, you can have fun. Your pets can engage with them and play, right? When I had Kitty Corbin used to play with the spirit that's here, right? Like it can actually be like kind of like a fun invisible roommate. And I know that sounds a little wonky to some of you, right? But it doesn't have to be scary is the main thing that I want to communicate, right? So if it's scary to you, set those boundaries. But if it's not scary, like that's okay, cool too, because it can be cool. Okay, so I talked to you about the fact that it took me a little while to accept the fact that I saw spirit, right? That I saw spirit and that they were around and they've been around, right? Everywhere that I've ever lived, I have been able to sense the spirits there and they've been there. It's not the same one. It's not like one follows me all around. It's an entity isn't connected to me, right? Like I've had my energy cleared. I have very, very strong boundaries, right? Nothing is there hanging out in my aura or, you know, like nothing is attached. Like I just sense what's there, right? Like there are lots of spirits and I sense them and they even come to me and I can communicate with them for other people. Sometimes they come to me and give messages to me for my friends who are living, right? I, to be clear, do not do that as a living, and I do not do it upon request. Like I have very clear boundaries about how and why I will do that. But there are tools that we can use when we do want to communicate. And sometimes we really do want to communicate. Sometimes we have questions about people who have crossed over. Sometimes we have questions about our ancestors. Sometimes we have just questions. Sometimes we have questions about who's hanging out in our apartment, right? Even if it seems cool and our cat is having a lot of fun, like sometimes we just want to know. And in that case, sometimes we want to use a tool to help us dig a little deeper because not all of us have the ability to communicate. Not all of us have those clairsenses or those psychic gifts. And in that case, that's when a Ouija board can be really helpful. So Ouija board, like I started earlier in this live, also called a spirit board before Ouija branded it, right? And you can still get spirit boards, right? Is a very useful tool. It does not have to be scary. It should be used like any other tool with a small amount of respect, right? So I'm going to walk you through some of the sort of the protocol. I'm going to walk you through the protocol that I use when I use a Ouija board. One of the big questions that I got this past weekend when I had posted the live asking people for their questions about witches, it's pretty common for witches. They get asked two questions very commonly. One is the good witch, bad witch question, which we answered earlier this week. The second one, Ouija boards come up. Like notoriously, Ouija boards get asked. Like people connect Ouija boards with witches. But so I want to talk about this tonight and I want to give you some tips on how to use this. I want to be clear that not all witches use Ouija boards, just like not all witches are kitchen witches, just like not all witches use crystals, just like not all witches do the same thing. All witches are individuals, but Ouija boards can be tools. And so I want to give you some tips to use them. I also want to give you tips because not everyone who uses a Ouija board is a witch. So if you know someone who has a Ouija board or if you know someone who's been curious about Ouija boards, you might bother to share this with them. And if you think they wouldn't want to have their name put in the conversation box down below, then privately give this to them so that they have these tips. So one of the big questions that I got, right, was, and I think that a lot of us probably can identify with this, is that some people used a Ouija board when they were much younger, like maybe in high school, and didn't know that it was a tool, a spiritual tool, right? Because it's sold with games, right? That I do have a problem with that, by the way. It's not a game. It shouldn't be sold with games. But they used it when they were a kid, and they didn't understand that it was a tool. And so they didn't know there was a protocol. They didn't know how to use it appropriately. And they just used it sort of playing around. And then they had an experience afterwards. And now they're kind of left with this feeling of like, was that connected to the Ouija board? What was that? Like, what did I do? Like, right? Like, And some people wrote me like, right? Like, what did I do? Did I open a portal? Like, what was that? Right? Like, what came through? Right? Like there's concern. Like, even like 10, 20 years later, right? Like, people are still like, what did I do with my Ouija board? Right? So let's talk about this. So first of all, my personal belief, and again, I can't speak for all witches, my personal belief is that it is a tool, and it is a spiritual tool, and all spiritual tools, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or a Ouija board, should be used with respect. They're powerful tools. Powerful tools. And if it's a powerful tool, then it can do powerful things. And the major thing that you're going to hear me talk about is intention. So if you're going to use a tool, hey Mimi, how are you? If you're going to use a tool, you want to be very clear about your intention, whether it's the Bible and let's talk about the Bible for a second. This is a good example. The intention, when you're reading the Bible, dictates almost what you see and what you find in the Bible, right? And we see this a lot because people read the Bible and they come up with sort of different interpretations. And that's because of their intention and what they're looking for in the Bible, right? So let's go back to Ouija boards. If you're using a Ouija board and you're using it by yourself, your intention matters. Your belief system matters. If you were raised with a belief system, even if it's not what you practice right now, but if that belief system still is down there somewhere, that you believe somewhere down there that something exists that you could potentially, I don't know, call up, conjure up, that word is used, right? Like open a portal to, that is an intention, right? And maybe it's not what you're trying to do, but it's a fear that's there, right? So when you're going to use a Ouija board, you need to be explicitly clear, like sort of meditative, sort of like clear in what you're doing, who you're trying to communicate with. And I'm going to give you other protocol you need to use, but that is the most important one. You need to know what you're doing and who you're communicating with. I would not probably use a Ouija board and just be like, woo, whoever wants to talk to me, come talk. I personally would not do that. Part of that is because I was raised in a blended family. I was raised in the Christian church. And in the Christian church, I know that in my deep psyche, in my subconscious, I have certain beliefs, and that if I open myself up, like there's lots of stuff, right? And I also know that I do believe that there are entities. And I have experienced that there are entities. And so I am careful what channels I open up. Opening a door to spirits is opening a door. Opening a door to ancestors is opening a door to all ancestors, no matter their intentions, no matter if they are super friendly ancestors or less friendly ancestors. So when you use a Ouija board, you need to be explicitly clear in your intention. There are other things you need to do. We're going to talk about those, but I want to make that clear. That doesn't mean it's dangerous. It just means it's a serious tool, and it's not a child's game. And if you're a parent, don't buy one for your kid like it's a game, because it's not. It's a spiritual tool. All right, so the first thing I do if I'm going to use a Ouija board is I wrote them down in order because I didn't know if I'd get myself distracted doing a live. Ground, cleanse, and hydrate. So anytime I'm doing spiritual work, especially if it involves healing or channeling, I hydrate because it takes a lot of energy, and hydration is super important. So anytime you're going to work with a Ouija board, I highly recommend hydrating. You ground yourself, meaning meditate, literally ground yourself, get yourself centered so you know what your intention is. You're in a good space. Always make sure you're coming at it with really positive energy. Never do it when you're sad, depressed, angry, etc. Positive intentions, positive energy. And cleanse, meaning like smudge or do whatever you do to cleanse the energy, right? Smudging is what I do to cleanse the energy. Energy of yourself, energy of the board, energy of the space you're working in. If you are a witch and you do circles, you can also cast a circle using salt or something else to use the board within, right? That is sort of protective. You could also use crystals. You could do a crystal grid. There are other ways to do sort of protection magic, but that's sort of advanced level and I can't totally get into all of that in one live. All right, the second thing is about intention. Make sure you know what your intention is going into this. Who is it that you want to contact? Even if you're opening yourself up, say like you're in an apartment and someone's communicating with you and you don't know who, like that's still an intention. You're not opening yourself up to anybody and who knows where coming through to communicate with you. You know what your intention is. If you're opening yourself up to your ancestors, like you want to know if there are ancestors who want to communicate with you, open yourself up to positive ancestors who want to come through, right? Oh, like be very clear and think before you do it about what your intention is going to be. Step number 3, who's involved? So if it's just you, you know who's involved and you know if you trust yourself. But oftentimes when we are using Ouija boards, a lot of times it's more than one person. Think about who's involved. Do you trust that person? Not just like, do you trust them to hang out with, but do you trust them to do this kind of work with? If you don't, you shouldn't be using a Ouija board with them. Do you trust them enough that you know in their sort of like core soul what their intention is for the work that you're about to do with them? And do you trust that what they're telling you is their actual intention? Do you trust that they've done the cleansing? Do you trust that they've done the homework? Do you trust that they've done the work to know and be in a space where they're ready to do this work and where they're not bringing anything that they may not even be aware of to this sort of space? Know who you're doing this with. Who are you doing with it, and do you trust them? Number 4, belief and intent. So I'm revisiting what I just said. Know your belief. Even if your belief is such that there is a devil, right? If your belief is such that there's a devil, if your belief is such that there are demons, know that going in so that you can protect yourself and guard yourself. It is better to know your belief so that you can be prepared for it and you can guard yourself than to be naive. If you grew up hearing all of that, that is in your subconscious somewhere, that is in your psyche. So even if it's not something that you subscribe to now, it's in there somewhere, and it is a fear. Because that's the way those things are taught. They're taught as fears. So know that. Communicate, right? You go through the process of using the Ouija board. I'm not giving directions on this live of how to do that, right? You go through that process, then you thank your ancestors. You thank the positive spirit that came through to communicate with you, because that takes energy, right? That takes energy from source, that takes energy from your ancestors, etc., right? You are grateful. You say thank you. You thank them. You close the session. This is really important. If you open a door, you close the door. This is good manners at home, and it's good manners in the spirit world. Open a window, close the window. Open a door, close the door. Close the door when you're done. You close the door. You then cleanse your space again. Okay, so if you're still in circle, you close everything out, right? If you are cleansing, you smudge everything back down, right? So you close, just like you open the experience back up, you close the experience back down, tighten it all back up, right? And you rehydrate yourself, and do sort of like a recheck in yourself. See how you're doing, right? Like check in with yourself. Check in with someone else if you did it with someone else. Kind of debrief about the situation. Kathy says, I can't do the board. My son used to see my nanny when he was younger. He had never met her. Oh, that's really sweet. I sometimes see my dad. That's really sweet too. Thank you, Kathy, for sharing that. Okay, so I know that the boards can be intimidating to people. I didn't want to end, that doesn't want to focus. I didn't want to end on the board. So let's also talk about simply communicating, because we can communicate without a board. You don't need a board to communicate, right? So Kathy did a really nice job of introducing this topic for me. Thank you, Kathy. I have said that, I can communicate. I've done that a couple times. I want to share some stories with you, but I want to talk to you by sharing these stories and give you some tips on ways you can do this. So if you're someone who prays, praying is a way you can do this, right? You can pray and you can ask for signs. You can pray to that person. You can also do writing, where you write with your non-dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, which is why I talk with it so much. You would write with your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, you would write with your left-handed, and you would write to them, right? And you would just sit and just journal, right? And sometimes if you do it long enough, right, like answers will start to come through, right? So there are different processes that you can use to try to communicate. You can ask for signs. You can ask for your spirit guides to send you signs. Talking to spirits and talking to ancestors is very similar to also talking to our guides and talking to angels, etc. They're existing in a similar sort of place or realm, maybe or maybe not the same exact realm. I don't have that knowledge, but a similar sort of process and a similar sort of place. Kathy says she asks them to come visit her. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Exactly, Kathy. So I want to share 3 experiences to close this out, to give you examples. The first one is when my grandfather passed. So when I say grandfather, it's my the grandfather that I grew up with, my step grandfather. I was at a wedding, and I'm an intuitive, is one of my gifts, right? So I was at a wedding, the end of my master's program, and it was my best friend at the time was getting married. It was on the other side of the state, and I was supposed to spend, like, she had gotten married, like we'd done the after party. I was supposed to spend the night, and I just had this feeling that I had to come home. Like, I didn't know why. I just knew I had to drive home. So I drove home, and I was almost home when my mom called me, and she said, I didn't want to tell you because I knew you were at the wedding, but Grandma and I have spent the day previously making Papa's funeral arrangements. He's not doing well. He's going to transition. You need to come home now. And I said, well, I'm almost home, right? Like, I was already on my way. And she said, oh, okay. She said, then I will, I'll call you when it's time. And I said, okay. I said, I want to be there. And she said, I know. And so I laid down because I just stayed up all night long, literally pulled an all-nighter. And I got up, and when I got up, my roommate said, what are you doing? I said, I'm putting on my pants because it's time. And she said, nobody's called. And I said, I just know. And my mom called, and she said, it's time. So again, intuition, being an intuitive. I got in my car, and I was 30 minutes away. And I was on the expressway, driving towards my grandparents' house, and I felt a hand on me. And I immediately knew that it was my grandpa. And I immediately thought that he had passed, because I didn't know yet that people, like, I didn't understand at that point in my life that there was sort of this like in-between realm where people could engage with us, right? And there is. That's why I'm sharing this with you. This in-between realm where people can be in both places and go back and forth. And when people are transitioning, when people are passing, they spend a lot more time sort of in this in-between realm and there than they do in their actual body. But so he had come to me in this in-between realm, right? To say goodbye, to let me know that he was okay, right? But so I spent time in my car with him in that form before I got to the house, and he was not really so much in his body anymore. But so that is one experience I have, right? Where I got to experience, right, my grandfather transitioning. So the second experience I want to share with you, and a way that we get to communicate with spirits, right, is my grandmother was passing not so long ago. She was transitioning. And some of you who know me well know this. And I wasn't able to be home. And she was in the hospital. She was on hospice. And each evening she appeared. I saw her, right? I started this off saying that I see spirits. And the first evening, I saw her in a nightgown. She always wore nighties. And so it wasn't scary to me at all because I immediately knew who it was. I immediately knew that it was Grandma. And it was very calming to me. And I was able to then use that to meditate and allow my higher self to communicate with her higher self to try to help her understand and do my part to try to help her understand that it was okay to go. That we were going to be okay, that it was okay for her to transition. So that's something else that people who are highly sensitive or who are mediums or who channel or who are psychics, right, or who have clairsenses can do, right? They can also help when people are transitioning to help communicate messages or to help people transition. So it's not just about communicating with the dead or communicating with the living. It's also about communicating with people who are kind of in an in-between sort of state, right? And the third thing that I want to share with you is that we can reach out to our ancestors and to our friends' ancestors, right? When we need something. Just like we can reach out to guides, and we can reach out to spirits and angels, right? So some of you know that my mom is in the hospital right now. And yesterday I found out and I was really upset, really upset. And I came home and I collapsed and I was in tears. And I just looked up and I was begging, right, for help. I was begging for my grandma to help her. Right, and I knew that she had just transitioned, and I knew that I've done enough work with Emily Jean, if you know Emily Jean. I knew that my grandma was taking some time to fully transition. I know that that's a process, but I begged her, right, that if she could help, to help. And instead, I got a sign that one of my friend's dads, right, who I communicate with regularly and channel messages for regularly, showed up for my mom instead. And he's been with me all day long today, giving me messages that it's going to be okay and that he's there for her. So I wanted to share this, even though it's new and even though I'm a little bit teary and even though it's fresh. I wanted to share this because I knew I was going to talk about this today, and I know how scary spirits can be for some people. I know how scary Ouija boards can be for some people. I know how scary ghosts can be for some people, right? But they don't have to be scary. They can be comforting, right? I cannot express to you in words how comforting it was knowing that someone else, a spirit, but someone else could be there for my dad and my mom. Right? He was there for my dad and he's there for my mom now. It was very, very powerful, right? It's essentially like having a guide that you can send ahead. So when you, right, that's another way that you can communicate. When you need something, all you have to do is ask. All you have to do is ask. You don't need a Ouija board. You don't need special gifts. We all have them. Some of us have more of them. But you just have to ask with intention. And boy, was my intention clear yesterday. Super clear. So, this week we've talked a lot about witches. We have talked a lot about witches. We've talked about who witches are. We've talked about what witches are, what they aren't. We have dissected witches from paganism and druidism and the occult and all sorts of other things. We've talked about what witches believe in. Do they believe in one god or two gods or goddesses or no gods, or are they heathens running around with no morals? Like, we've talked about all of that. We've talked about the rule of three and the fact that witches believe that they do good and that good comes back to them, and witches do good because they understand that if they don't do good, that comes back to them too, right? We have talked about the different kinds of witches, sea witches and kitchen witches and crystal witches and modern witches and knowledge witches and intellectual witches and all the different kinds of witches, right? So many more kinds of witches than I just listed. We have talked about tools, we've talked about spells, we've talked about crystals, we've also talked about Ouija boards, we've talked about spirits, we've talked about so many things, and we have only touched the tip of the witch iceberg. There's so much more to learn, my friends. So much more. So I look forward to continuing to come live to you about these topics. Probably not every day, but I continue to look forward to continuing to shine a light on the witchy stuff. With that, I thank you for sticking with me today, sticking with me this week, learning about these topics, being brave, showing up, and spreading the love and letting your friends know about this. With that, I'm going to pop off here. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Hugs and kisses, everyone.